I'm John Batchelor with Larry Kudlow, CNBC, Kudlow Radio on the Weekend, my colleague and co-host, and we're joined by Brian Blase of Mercatus. Brian has a new study up I recommend to everyone. Affordable Care Act. Remember that? The last election, we turned everything on the decision by the Supreme Court, whether it was or is not the Commerce Clause and the rendering by Justice Roberts. I won't go down that path because we're dealing with post-2012. We're dealing with numbers from 2014, the basis for the new results from Brian. And I come here to say that in my conversation with Brian, what I learned is the explanation for the trouble with the Affordable Care Act now was always there if you take into account how the marketplace works. People, human beings, especially Americans, will make a market to their advantage. That's the nature of Adam Smith's lesson in 1776. It apparently did not come to the designers, the creators, the geniuses behind the Affordable Care Act that after several years, it would look very much to be to the advantage of the people who are enrolled and to the disadvantage of the people who make up the difference, sometimes known as the subsidies. Brian, a very good evening to you. I want to begin with the general understanding of the study that you've published for 2014 for the Affordable Care Act, that the enrollees, the people who use the Affordable Care Act plans, the three, the bronze, the silver, and the gold, that the enrollees are older, sicker, and cagier than the Obama administration imagined, allowed for, or expected. Is all that correct? Good evening to you, Brian.
Good evening, John. You're correct. In 2016, we were supposed to get sort of Obamacare status quo, that people had learned about the law, had been in effect for 3 years. The individual mandate penalty was reaching its maximum threshold, and people would have learned about the subsidies, and the exchanges would sort of reach a stable equilibrium. And what we're finding with sort of large insurance companies raising their premiums by over 20% on average, with many of the co-ops funded with Affordable Care Act loans going under, and with United Healthcare, the largest insurer in the country, exiting almost all the state exchanges, that the law isn't working out the way the insurers or the administration expected. And you're perfectly on point that people are responding rationally, and individuals who it's in their economic self-interest to purchase the coverage, and those are individuals who receive large subsidies, or individuals who have expensive health conditions are buying the coverage, and individuals who are in the middle class and who are relatively healthy, who have to face relatively high premiums and deductibles, aren't purchasing the coverage.
So, Brian, just take it through. So the selection process hasn't worked, and now the Obamacare wants these big insurers to keep putting out the same products to keep ACA going. But they can't unless, of course, the government is willing to pay massive new amounts of subsidies to avoid large premium increases by the insurers. But it'll bankrupt everybody. I mean, the government, how much can they pay out? As you say, United Healthcare just dropped out of the system. Others are bound to follow. This is a flawed idea to begin with, because risk pricing is out the window, and we're just going to cover the losses. That's the way I read it.
So the majority of the revenue that insurers have received selling exchange plans has come through government subsidies. So on the front end, insurers get subsidies to reduce premiums and to reduce deductibles. And there was a 3-year program put in place to get Obamacare off the ground that distributed, in the first 2 years, $16 billion to insurers to offset the large cost of their most expensive enrollees. So that back-end subsidy program goes away. And you're right. I mean, insurers are facing the reality that the exchanges are generally broken, and they're now making tough decisions about sort of leaving the marketplace.
And the Congress put a cap on these subsidies, didn't they?
Yeah, you're referring to the risk corridor program, which could have turned into a taxpayer bailout because insurers with losses far exceeded the amount that insurers who made gains, and there was supposed to be a transfer through risk corridors from insurers that made profits to insurers that made losses. And Congress, starting in December 2014, made the risk corridor program budget neutral to avoid a taxpayer bailout.
Brian, I want to concentrate on what we've learned recently. The administration is pushing back about deductibles, about on the Obamacare plan. And you have a post this is since we talked last, you have a post at Forbes today that the Obama administration is misleading. How so? And is this misleading witting, or is it that they don't have good data?
Thanks for that question, John. The administration released an estimate today that the median deductible of someone choosing an exchange plan is $850. But they didn't release the average. The average deductible, which I calculated based on their figures, was 2.5 times the median amount. But the median deductible actually is an indication of how the law has failed. So more than half of the enrollees qualify for these things called the cost-sharing reduction subsidies that reduce the amount of deductibles for many people below $500. So really, you have a bimodal distribution. You have a whole bunch of people who have very low deductibles, and then you have people who are in the market that have $3,000 deductibles for silver plan coverage and $6,000 deductibles for bronze coverage. That significantly increases the mean amount. And actually, the fact that the median deductible is relatively low is a sign that the ACA is failing to attract people in the middle class who don't qualify for those subsidies to reduce the size of the deductible.
I see. So this restates the study that you published on 2014. This is another way of saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's confirmation that the ACA, the plans aren't attractive to people who earn at least a middle class income.
So what happens here? I mean, first of all, Brian, tell me if I'm wrong, but there's some very substantial premium increases going around the country. I mean, big double-digit premium increases, which I don't know if insurance companies are not allowed to do that. They're doing it, or else they're expecting the government to bail them out through this risk corridor program or what's left of it. I don't see how this system holds. I don't see how it just doesn't collapse.
So insurance companies have to be solvent. So they're looking at what they need to raise premiums in order to maintain their solvency, and they're looking at. I mean, last year premiums went up the low double digits, and this year the requests for premiums are over 20%. Pretty much throughout the country, there aren't very many states where the law is working well, and you're right. I mean, higher premiums lead to the adverse selection spiral, right? Higher premiums make the coverage even less attractive to people who are relatively young and healthy, which causes them to leave the market, which in further, it puts upward pressure on premiums in the future. So you sort of have that spiral where Obamacare is largely becoming a high-risk pool for people who qualify for extremely large subsidies.
Older, sicker, and cagier. Now, there's some good news. There's some positive news, Larry. Brian and I have bypassed it. We're going to step back to it because the small group plans from the Obamacare are successful, and there's a human nature explanation here. As I understand it, Brian, when you hire somebody, you're making decisions about their health, how they fit in, and how they work with their colleagues. And so therefore that influences how they use their medical care and how they're subsidized in order to gain that medical care. Do I remember that correctly?
Yeah, you do, John. So we found that the large losses in 2014 were concentrated in the individual market, and insurers offering the Obamacare plans in the small group market were able to sort of minimize their losses. And we speculate that that is largely because, one, people who have jobs, they have to be healthy enough in order to work. And two, it's much harder to game the system if you have a job. Like one of the big complaints from insurers is that people have waited until they're sick. Because Obamacare requires insurers to offer coverage at any point to someone at a standard rate, incentivizes people to wait until they're sick to purchase coverage, and through what's a special enrollment period. And with a group health insurance plan through your employer, you can't really do that.
So I don't know how this is fixable. Okay, to me, the whole system is so jury-rigged that it falls of its own financial weight as well as its own mandate weight. I don't understand how this could continue.
Yeah, largely it's been propped up by unlawful payments from the administration to insurers as well. We talked about the cost-sharing reduction program. 2 months ago, a federal judge ruled that the administration was making illegal payments to insurers through that program. The Congress had never appropriated the money, and that payment over the first 2 years amounted to $7 billion. And we know through a separate program, the reinsurance program, which is this back-end subsidy program, that the administration was supposed to deliver nearly $4 billion to Treasury, that it's diverted from Treasury to insurance companies.
Yeah, let me read the quote from Judge Rosemary Collier. Paying out without an appropriation violates the Constitution. Congress is the only source for such an appropriation, and no public money can be spent without one. Larry, I think you've identified not only a failing program, but a failing administration.
Yeah, to me, look, I oppose this thing from the beginning, but as these numbers roll in, as Brian and others are, scoring this and chronicling this, it just falls of its own weight and has to be scrapped, and we're going to have a whole new program. Presumably, Brian, one without mandates that has a lot of choice, for example, health savings accounts and whatnot. But to me, this thing was doomed from the very beginning.
Yeah, I think when we talk about healthcare reform and fixing health insurance markets, we should not think of health insurance as primarily about income redistribution. And the economic formula set up in Obamacare leads to all sorts of creates all sorts of incentives for sort of these bad, perverse outcomes that we find.
Brian, is there in the literature, in the creating literature for the Affordable Care Act, statements, arguments by the advocates, the people who were who wanted this to happen, that of their own, out of the goodness of their nature, young, healthy Americans with jobs will sign up and pay more than they need to in order to make Affordable Care Act successful? Did they make those big utopian speeches?
John, I think they really thought that the individual mandate would have had much greater effect on younger, relatively healthy people than it has. I know the Congressional Budget Office, the key mistake with their projections is because they overweighted the importance of the individual mandate. I also don't think that they didn't know exactly what type of insurance products would be offering through the exchanges. And the high deductible insurance products, if you're a healthy 30-year-old and you're looking at paying a $3,000 premium for a policy that has a $4,000 deductible, you're thinking, well, am I going to spend more than $7,000 on health care next year? And the vast majority of them aren't. So the products they're just not attractive.
Boy, yeah, there you go. I don't know.
Larry, have we made sure that everybody understands the plane crashed? It's over?
That's the way I look at it. Trump wants to have a new system. Hillary wants to expand the system. I just don't think there is a system. It's completely unworkable, Brian.
Older, cagier, and sicker. That's what you get. Unless, Brian, was there any way this was going to work? Do they have doubts now? You hear their chit chat all the time. Do they doubt themselves? Are they looking at this again, given your numbers?
I think they have doubts, but most of their solutions are to increase the subsidies. It's not to sort of revisit the core.
In other words, when redistribution doesn't work, redistribute the more.
That's right. That's what Hillary's saying, basically.
One pair, yes. Brian Blase, Mercatus, he has a piece up at Forbes right now about the latest extreme decisions made by the Obama administration, and I recommend the study from the 2014 numbers. Is determinative. There's no partisanship whatsoever. It's about dollars. I'm John Batchelor with Larry Kudlow, CNBC, Kudlow Radio on the Weekend.